All right, and that's the last thing I note from Tuesday. All right, so you don't need to type this down because you already had it. So on Tuesday we were talking about we started with talking about the second major world religion that has its origins in South Asia. You guys remember what we were talking about? Buddhism. Buddhism, good. All right, and Buddhism kind of stems out from Hinduism. The founder, Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha, was a member of the Kshatriya caste. All right. At one point, like I said, he kind of like experiences three things that kind of blow his mind and kind of lead him to kind of become an ascetic and try to find the spiritual truth in that. When he figures that out, after meditating on that banyan tree, he establishes what they consider the kind of core beliefs of the religion of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. Right, and there's certain aspects that are similar within Hinduism, like karma and dharma. But ultimately, you want to kind of stop the cycle of reincarnation. For Buddhists, it's nirvana. Right, for Hindus, it's moksha, which are kind of similar ideas in that sense. But like I was saying, initially after the Buddha dies in the 5th century, it's not a major religion. Right, you can almost consider it an offset of kind of a sect of Hinduism. Right, and then we were kind of talking about how politically. India had basically kind of like we saw like kind of groups like the Persians and the Greeks kind of come in the area, and then around the kind of like I guess into the kind of the 3rd century BC, we start to see the first century BC. We start to see the first native Indian empire, the Mauryans, right? So we talked about Chandragupta, the founder, a very autocratic type of government based on kind of like an absolute ruler. However, at one point he kind of searches for spirituality, steps down, gives his son Bindusari the keys to the kingdom, and he kind of goes off and is a Jain, a monk. Unfortunately, in his quest for kind of spirituality, he not only meditates, but he also fasts, and that fasting is then going to cost him his life. His son Bindusari maintains the Mauryan Empire, or kind of expands it a little bit, but it's his son, Ashoka, is probably the most famous one. Ashoka is able to, initially he's referred to as Ashoka the Cruel. Like I was telling you, there's a legend in which before he actually solidified power, he killed 99 of his half-brothers, which may be a bit of an exaggeration numerically. He was often referred to as Ashoka the Cruel in some certain legends there. And then after a battle with a state called Kalinga, which his grandfather could never kind of conquer, his father couldn't conquer. After conquering them, it was like after 1 million casualties were kind of after the battle. He had what alcoholics refer to as a kind of a moment of clarity. He kind of changed his belief system, started to delve into more Buddhist kind of theology, and based his type of governing on Buddhist principles. He issued those edicts, those stone pillars, those rock edicts, to get the word across. All right. Because of him, Buddhism was able to really kind of like become its own religion. He helped it flourish in a bit. However, after he dies, because he kind of changed government so much, within 50 years, his empire falls apart. Mainly because you have kind of weak rulers after him, but also some of those states that were subjugated through military might start to kind of take advantage of the situation and kind of assert their independence. So we see a lot of disunity for about 500 years. You have these smaller Indian states that are emerging. There's an empire called the Kushan Empire that's based out of Afghanistan. That kind of like controls some areas in what is Pakistan, northern India. All right, and then around the 4th century A.D., that's when India reunifies under another native Indian empire, and that's the Gupta. Not to be confused with Chandragupta Maurya. Gupta is like kind of a Sanskrit word, loosely meaning like governor. All right. And so this is the first time we're delving into AD, right? And so AD, they kind of count up, if you will. All right, so this is the first time India is going to be reunified under a kind of one central rule since the time of the Mauryan Empire. So geographically speaking, this is what the kind of the Gupta, kind of India under the Gupta looked like. Much of the same territory, with the exception of these areas south of the Vindhya Mountains, expanding into what is now modern-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, and those areas. But the thing is that the Guptas were kind of a Kshatriya family, right, kind of in their origins in the north. The initial king of the kind of first king of the family was simply just called Gupta. But what we're kind of concerned about is the kind of the status of the empire. So the founder of the Gupta Empire, it's not necessarily the first king, but the first one to take the title, Maharaja de Raja, which means king of kings. And historians generally, if you're kind of using that king king of kings, it usually means like somebody big, stronger than a king. So it would be considered the first emperor. What we know about him is relatively limited, though. There's a couple coin inscriptions here that believe that much of his power may have been vested in the fact that he married well. Right, he married into another family that had some dominant control in northern India. He is succeeded by his son Samudragupta through inscriptions. Still takes the title of Maharaja the Raja. All right. Matter of fact, he actually kind of some of his histories are based on these pillars that he had kind of inscripted some of his exploits on. One of those pillars was one that Ashoka had established. He kind of just basically kind of really had things kind of chiseled out over there. All right, so these are the first two. He expands it to the Ganges River, which is important because the Ganges River is the holiest river in Hinduism. And the Guptas are devout Hindus, right? However, they do allow for other religions to flourish, like Buddhism. There's a number of it was during the Gupta period where there was a kind of a temple built in honor of the spot where the Buddha became enlightened, right? And so from these gold coins, they believe this is from the kind of inscription here, loosely translated, that this is probably Chandragupta the First. In a number of the coins, you see him and his wife on there, where they believe is his wife together. So that probably signifies that his marriage with her basically kind of increased his power. And then this is a coin of Samudragupta, which is a little hard to kind of vision here. But up here is what they call a Gauda, which is a kind of a large bird kind of creature that in the story of Vishnu, this was how Vishnu would get around in certain cases. All right, so this is kind of basically tying him with the god Vishnu. All right, so the Gupta, who are Hindus, probably kind of elevated the kind of the status of Vishnu a little bit more than Shiva. All right, and then the most famous one is Chandragupta II. Again, no relation to Chandragupta Maurya here. All right, he's the one who's going to create the largest empire since the time of the Mauryans, since Ashoka. All right, now his story, there's a legend where he wasn't actually supposed to be emperor. His brother Ramagupta was the emperor, and there's in this legend, Ramagupta lost a battle to a people called the Saka, who were kind of this kind of they were kind of nomadic, kind of horse culture. They resided in kind of the North Plateau of Iran into kind of Central Asia there. To add insult to injury, Ramagupta was defeated by the Sakans, and the Sakan chieftain or king took his wife, Ramagupta's wife, back to him to their kind of like their campsite, if you will. All right, they're kind of their headquarters. All right, their capital. Chandragupta thought this was an insult that needed to be kind of rectified. So, according to the legend, he himself took a small garrison, I think, with him, went to where the Sakan kind of king was, chieftain was, dressed himself as a woman, went into the court and killed the Sakan king and took his sister-in-law. He goes back to India, tells his brother Ramagupta, she is no longer your wife, she is my wife, and you are no longer king. All right, and so after that, Ramagupta's kind of either kind of exiled or killed. All right, it's somewhat confusing, but he is basically going to kind of have this legend kind of associated with his kind of his rise to power, if you will. This is a coin of him riding on horseback. He looks pretty tall on that horse. Probably the horse is kind of coming from Central Asia. Like when we talk about the Mongols, you'll see that it's they're a little bit smaller horses. They're not quite the big stallions that you would have in the Middle East or Europe, right? This is his pillar. The most famous pillar is associated with him. It's called the Iron Pillar. It's in New Delhi, and it has some of his inscriptions in on here. Some of it's faded out, but this is in a form of Sanskrit. It's called Bindi script, which is so it talks about his exploits here. It surprisingly has it's not so much rust on there, or something that was kind of created in the 4th century AD. The deal about Indian history, particularly during the time of the Guptas, is that it's hard to get exact kind of dates. Really, in reality, what we really should be talking about is circa. Have you ever heard anyone say when talking about dates, you know what circa means? Around, yeah, roughly around. Okay, so there's this concept within kind of Indian history through the kind of a lot of these legends and stories kind of passed down through oral tradition. Called itas, right? And even when they're written down, there seems to be a lack of dates. So it's sometimes hard, historians have to kind of trace back kind of dates and then try to compare them to kind of the Western perspective, because AD and BC is particularly kind of a Western Christian perspective, if you will. All right. So it makes it hard to kind of sometimes interpret kind of Gupta history as a result of this. But what we do know here, and this is probably a question on the test for sure, is that during the time of the Guptas, that 300-year period is often referred to as the golden age in Indian history, right? Meaning in culture. particularly when it comes to kind of mathematics, science, literature, and stuff like that, architecture. Mathematics in particular. This was during this age also where the kind of the Guptas are credited with the development of chess. All right. But it was just during this time where like kind of our number systems that we use today, like the numbers that you use, like 1 through, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those are referred to as Arabic numerals, but in reality they have their origins here in India. All right. And so I want to play this short little video that talks about Indian mathematics here and the significance of the numbers.
Started with a dream. According to Hindu tradition, the world began from nothing when it was dreamed by Brahma, the creator god of India. Ancient Hindu chants and writings contain calculations of these Brahma cycles, outlining Indian mathematical works back to the 4th century BC. Interestingly, the ancients used words to express numbers. The word arms was used as the number 2, since humans have 2 arms. But words didn't lend themselves for calculations, so around 10 BC, they were replaced by symbols.
The Babylonians had 2 symbols. This symbol signified 1, 60, and 3,600, and this symbol signified 10. Obviously, with only 2 symbols, the applications were limited. To write 6, it took 6 symbols. Even in the Roman system, it took 2 symbols. In the Indian system, however, it took only 1 symbol.
For more convenience and accuracy, the ancient Hindu language, Sanskrit, replaced word numbers with 9 single digits.
It is the Indian system of 9 digits that we use today. It's the last symbol of this ingenious system for which we remain forever indebted to the ancient Indian thinkers. 0. For them, the symbol stood for the Sanskrit word shunya, meaning nothing. But once the concept became a symbol, mathematical computation was born. Just like Brahma's dream, from nothing came everything.
The impact of India's long history with the 0 can be felt across our high-tech world. No 0, no binary system, no computers. Without the concept of 0, modern mathematicians and physicists would all be out of a job. Numbers have become so much a part of our daily lives that we forget where they came from. And if you ask most people about the origin of our numbers, they'll probably say they were Arabic.
Arab traders introduced the 10-digit system to the West around 900 AD. But even in their own records, Arab scholars refer to the Indian system. In all likelihood, the Arabs picked up the Indian way of counting in a marketplace, much like this one.
Alright, so probably the most famous mathematician that's associated with the Gupta lived during that time was a mathematician named Aryabhata. Aryabhata he's what we call a polymath. He's somebody who's well versed in different disciplines and that. Within mathematics, he's credited with kind of combining the known and unknown quantities in that sense. Eventually, this gets to the Muslim world, and we'll talk later. We're going to talk about chapter 6. A guy named Al-Khwarizmi. He compiles these kind of studies that kind of start with Aryabhata in something called algebra, which becomes the basis for what we call algebra. Like I said, there the number system that we use today, it's Arabic numerals, but it comes from India. And so he's also credited with kind of establishing the kind of the decimal system based on 10. All right. He calculated the circumference of pi. He also studied kind of the constellations and astronomy and that, and studied eclipses. He may have been an early proponent of something like the heliocentric model, the idea that the sun is the center of the universe. Although there's some debate about that. And then even kind of studied what we would later refer to as force of gravity, all right, some years before Sir Isaac Newton. But the 0 is important in that sense because the only other culture that kind of developed a numerical system where you have a symbol that represents nothing would be the Mayans in Mesoamerica. All right, so like the video said, this is important for computers with binary numbers. And so Aryabhata, and there's some others, but he's probably the most famous one, are going eventually these ideas are going to make their way west as Arab traders come in contact with Europeans. Like prior to that in Europe, the mainly numerical system that you're using was Roman numerals. And if you ever watched the Super Bowl or at any time, writing out Roman numerals can be very tedious. So this makes it a little bit more simplified. There's a statue with, I believe, Zarya Bhatsa in front of the university. And some of the, like, in the kind of Gupta empires would kind of bankroll these schools that would kind of classify as universities. And then in literature, probably the most famous playwright, kind of the Shakespeare of India, lived during the time of the Guptas, and that's a guy named Kalidasa. Kalidasa wrote a number of plays. The most famous one is called Shakuntala. He also wrote kind of stories that were based on Hindu mythology and that. What he has basically lays the foundation for is nearly every kind of Bollywood movie through this concept called rasas, which is these pure emotions that basically in every story, the emotions range from happiness to sadness, joy, anger, all this range in there. All right, so every Bollywood movie kind of owes a debt of gratitude to Kalidasa, and he also wrote in Sanskrit, which kind of maintained the kind of ancient language. A little bit of an elitist to a certain extent, but it kind of maintains this this sense of it's kind of like when we talk about the Renaissance, where you had humanists writing in Latin to a certain extent. By that time, like Latin had already been kind of out of date. All right, so that's India for the section here. Next time we'll talk about India. If you're with me, second semester, we'll be in chapter 8. So next week we'll start talking about Chickadee China. Monday I'll send out a video kind of introducing the 4 dynasties that we'll talk about, and then we'll knock that out by the end of the week, hopefully. All right.